things. I encourage you to get a Bible now, and let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I was asked some weeks ago if I would take a look at 1 Corinthians 7, and because of some of the confusion that circles around chapter 7, at least among brethren, not even to mention what's going on in the religious world as a whole. Here's what we're going to see in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I want us to get an overview of what the chapter is about, the point being made, and then we want to look at the setting. And then we want to look at some of the confusion about the text. And then we want to look at some lessons that we learn from the text that are very practical to take home with us. And so we ought to be familiar generally with 1 Corinthians 7. We've studied it multiple times in Bible class. And most anyone that shows up on a Sunday night is generally a better Bible student than some who don't come as often as others. So you should have a general understanding at least of 1 Corinthians 7. So this shouldn't be new ground for most of us. But we'll seek to clarify some things as we go along. Let's start with an overview of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians 7 is about questions concerning marriage. What were those questions? Paul said, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me," that's verse 1. So apparently the Corinthians had delivered to Paul some questions they had. We don't have a copy of the questions, but we have a general idea of the question from the answer. You understand that if you hear one side of a conversation, of a phone conversation, and you hear someone answering a question, you may not hear the question, but you have the general idea from the answer that they give. So when I read the answers that he gives, he says, "I'm answering your questions." And then he gives the answers. He doesn't tell us what the question was. We have a general idea what the questions were. So here are some of the questions. We may not know the exact wording, but these are the kinds of things that he addresses. For example, is marriage lawful? He addresses that question. Whether they ask that or not, he answers that. So that must have been one of their questions. Well, one of the questions must have been, must those who are married continue in the marriage? Seemingly a circumstance, and we'll give evidence why we say seemingly, a circumstance where you have two non-Christians and one of them has now become a Christian. Do we stay in that marriage? So should we stay together in our marriage? Another question would be, what about continuing with the unbeliever? If I'm now married to an unbeliever, now that I've become a Christian and my mate did not become a Christian, should I stay in that marriage? And is that kind of marriage a legitimate marriage? And what about children that come out of that union? Are they legitimate children? And furthermore, what if an unbelieving mate decides they want to leave? What if my mate now says, because of your faith, you've changed. You have an allegiance to this person you call Christ, and now I'm going to leave you because you're fanatical in your belief. What do you do then? What are your responsibilities? He answers that. And furthermore, should virgins marry? And what about widows? Should they remarry? And is there anything that they should do when they remarry? Now, those are the questions that he answers, and we don't have time to get to the details of each one of those. So let's look at an overview by looking at an outline of the chapter. As you know, that ought to give us kind of a general view of the chapter if we can get an outline of what's going on in 1 Corinthians 7. So let's do a quick outline of chapter 7. What's going on in chapter 7? There seems to be three major sections to the chapter. The first one is it lawful to marry, verses 1 to 9. Secondly, must those who are married continue in marriage? And then thirdly, what about virgins and widows? Should they marry? Let's take this question of, is it lawful to marry? In verse 1, he said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He's talking about touching in the sense of having a relationship in marriage. He said it's better not to be married. That was his answer. Now, we'll see why he would say that in just a moment. So he said it's good not to marry. Notice again in verse 6, he said that, or verse 7, I wish that all men were even as myself. I wish that everyone would remain like I am. I'm not married. Then he says at verse 9 that it would be better to marry than to burn with passion. But in that context of answering that question, he says marriage is proper and right. In fact, that ought to be done to avoid fornication, verses 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then he says, it's better to marry if you can't contain because of the desire. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. So is it lawful to marry? Yes. Should you, under the circumstance under which he writes, he said it's better not to. We'll see what that circumstance is in a moment. Then he moves secondly to verses 10 to 24. Must those who are married continue in marriage? And his answer is, don't depart, don't divorce. Should they continue in marriage? Yes. Don't divorce. What if a believer is married to an unbeliever? What is the believer to do? They're not to depart. Don't divorce your mate. Then he says in verses 17 to 24, you remain in the state in which you were called. Look at verse 17. He said, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. What's his point? Notice in verse 20, that each one remain in the same calling in which you was called. Whatever circumstance you were in when you obeyed the gospel, stay in that circumstance. Now we'll talk about the context of that in a moment, but he is not talking about an unscriptural marriage. He's talking about if you're married to a non-Christian, when you obey the gospel, then you stay with that non-Christian. So the answer to the question, should you continue in marriage? Absolutely yes, continue in that marriage relationship. Then the third section is concerning virgins, should they marry? And he says in verse 25, beginning, that concerning them, he said, I suppose, verse 26, that it is good because of the present distress, it's good for a man to remain even as he is. In other words, don't marry. But if he does marry, he later tells us, 27 and 28, he's not sinned. Well, what about widows? Should they remarry? And his answer to that it's better not to marry. But if they do marry, let them marry in the Lord, he said. Now that's the chapter. He's answering questions about marriage. So now let's talk about the setting in the context. What do we mean by the setting? Well, I want you to see that at verse 26 he talks about a present distress. At verse 26, I suppose that it's good because of the present distress. You might underline that in your Bible because that becomes a key to interpreting much in the chapter. Let's take the words that are used here. First of all, there is the word distress. Thayer says it means calamity, distress, or straits. Bedag says it means in a state of distress or trouble, distress, calamity, or pressure. Lowell says it means trouble, troublesome, distress, troublesome times. So it has to do with stressful times, troublesome times. The word present suggests it's happening now, it's current, according to Bedag. Now let's look at some translations that may help us with that. We want to get an understanding, what could this present distress be? What is that? Because that's going to become a key. The American Standard says of the distress that is upon us. We better understand that. There is distress that is current. Furthermore, the New Century Version says the present time is a time of trouble. The NIV says the present crisis. The NET says the impending crisis. Darby says the present necessity. Well, that may not help us as much as some of the other translations, though that is a correct translation of that, I understand. So it has to do with some crisis or distress that is currently upon us, at least at the time Paul is writing this letter. I'm getting better understanding of what's going on. Now let's look at some comments. Not all of these I agree with, so I'm not presenting these as all good comments, but I want to get an idea of what some people are saying concerning the present distress. Albert Barnes says, in the present state of trial, the word distress denotes calamity and persecution or trial, as in Luke chapter 21. All right, that gives me an idea that there's some kind of trial or tribulation that is current that has to do with the context that he's talking about. Furthermore, Pulpit says, for the present distress, rather an account of pressing necessity in the urgent trying conditions which at the present moment surrounds the Christian life and which were the prophesied woes of the Messiah. In other words, just as the Messiah suffers, is what they're saying, then those who are disciples of the Messiah, they're going to suffer as well, and this is suffering of those who are, in other words, persecution, is what they're talking about. Linsky said, by this distress, Paul refers to the painful and terrible experience which the confession of Christ may at any time bring upon a believer. Paul had many such experiences, and the Corinthians may well recall the hostile Jews tried to do what the hostile Jews tried to do to Paul in the very city of Corinth. The days of extensive pagan persecution were drawing nigh. A married girl, a girl that married and reared a family might be doubly or triply overwhelmed. for her beloved husband might become involved, or she with him. And what about the children? In other words, here's a Christian, woman marries a Christian, and now she's going to suffer, and maybe her husband suffering along with her, and because she is dedicated now to the Lord, or maybe her husband is dedicated to the Lord. Lang, I don't agree with all that Lang said, but I do suggest here that Lang says it may have reference to some fearful crisis just preceding the coming of Christ. That is, just before the second coming, some crisis at the end. I'll mention more about that here in just a moment. G. Campbell Morgan said, I do think that it's referring to local condition. I think it's referring to the pressure of circumstance in the midst of which the church was living at Corinth, some local kind of problem. David Lipscomb said the distress means the persecution then raging against Christian. And then finally, Burton Kaufman said the situation at Corinth was probably a local outburst of persecution which became more general at a later date. Now, I gave all of that to simply raise this question. What are some of the views about the present distress? Well, it was some kind of trial, obviously, because that's what the word means. Some kind of trial. Some think it means toward the end of time that may be impending. That's the one that I mentioned a moment ago. Lang suggests that. I don't think that's what he's talking about. It seems to be, some thinks it has to do with some kind of severe famine. But others think it has to do with oppression and a persecution, which seems to be the meaning of the words. Some kind of persecution that comes upon Christians perhaps more locally than widespread, though it probably was widespread much later. So now what are some conclusions I can draw? Well, it's some form of a trial or oppression or persecution. And it perhaps was of an early form that later grew, that it may have been small at the beginning, but then it grows larger as time goes on. But persecution is mentioned in the context of the book. We won't take the time, but chapter 4 talks about that. Chapter 15 alludes to that. So there is persecution going on, and it seems to be some form of persecution that perhaps is general, but likely it may have reference to some local circumstance under which these Christians were facing some kind of pressure, and due to that, he answers some things and says some things in the context. Now, let's talk about the time. Verse 29 suggests that it's a short period of time. Notice at verse 29, or verse 26, the present distress, and then later in the context, he leaves an impression that in verse 29, 30, and 31, that this is a short period of persecution. This is a short period of distress, that is. Whatever this distress is, it seems to be short and it seems to be severe. Perhaps parallel to Matthew 24 and in verse 22. Let's turn there just to get a clue of what's going on. In the destruction of Jerusalem, verse 22 said that unless those days be shortened, no flesh could be saved, but for the elect's sake, these days will be shortened. And so perhaps this is some kind of short, severe period of persecution wherein the pressure is severe, the pressure is hard, making it difficult for those who are non-Christians married to Christians as well as for the Christians themselves. And you'll see more about that in a moment. But I want to suggest that explains a lot of things in the context. And that's why I ask you to go back at verse 26, if you haven't already from a previous study, and underline present distress. Maybe make some marginal notes about that and suggest that's a key to understanding much of the chapter. For example, why is it better not to marry? Because of the present distress. Paul is not saying it's better not to get married, period, end of sentence. Because God said it's not good that man should be alone. I've got to harmonize that with Genesis chapter 2. It is under the present distress it's better not to be married. Now look beginning at verse 33 and verse 34. I'm going to paraphrase and you can read that. But verse 33 and 34 shows us that there's a natural tendency, at least there should be, for a man or a woman to try to please their mate. In other words, do what's best for them. Be interested in their welfare. So if you are a Christian and your mate is a non-Christian and you know you're going to be persecuted for your faith, and because of your care and concern for your mate, you may want to back off on your faith just a little bit so the pressure's not so hard on your family. So it's better not to be married under those circumstances. So that's the context. But that explains something else. Why is it better to marry a Christian when you're remarrying? When earlier in the chapter, and we're talking about verse 39 now, when earlier in the chapter what he had said was, if you're married to a non-Christian, stay with them. Nothing wrong with being married to a non-Christian. within itself. But why is it better when you remarry to marry a Christian? Because of this present distress. It would be better for both of you to have the same faith going through this than for you to have somebody that's pulling you back during this persecution. Now I know the context, an overview, and I know the setting. Let's thirdly talk about the confusion. What's some of the confusion over the chapter so that some appeal to the chapter and make misapplication and they're confused? Here's one. We're going to list three. To justify divorce for any cause. To justify divorce for any cause. Let's look at verses 10 and 11. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. Now here's the point. Look at verse 11. But if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And so several of our own brethren have taken that text and said, I know it's saying it's better not to divorce, but actually verse 11, they argue, is saying, if you do, it's okay. So I'm going to divorce my mate, they say. Well, on what basis? Where is the biblical basis? Well, 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11. You're not supposed to, really. But if you do, it's okay, because that's what God just said. Verse 11. So you can divorce your mate for any cause. God doesn't want you to, but it's okay if you do. Well, let's look at this context. We'll see more in just a moment. This is non-permissive. This is contingency law. There is nothing in verses 10 and 11 that says, if you do, there's nothing wrong with that. This simply shows you the alternative that you have if you do violate the law of God. In fact, let's notice it verse 10. Verse 10 and verse 11 both specifically say, do not divorce. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart, that means divorce, we'll give evidence of that later, from her husband. A wife is not to divorce her husband. That is a prohibition. Now verse 11, but if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. There's the command. Verse 10 said don't divorce, verse 11 said don't divorce. So that doesn't grant divorce for any cause. Here's a second misunderstanding and confusion to justify divorce and remarriage among those who are non-Christians. The idea is that the non-Christian is not amenable to the law of Christ. So if you're not a Christian or you're married to a non-Christian, God's law doesn't apply to your marriage. So you can divorce for whatever reason, and you can remarry, and you can divorce and remarry, and divorce and remarry, and divorce and remarry 50 times if you wish. The only time God's law applies to you is if two of you are Christians. They tell us. And so what evidence do they have? Well, they appeal to 1 Corinthians 7 to make that point. Their argument is this, that the Lord's teaching does not apply to non-Christians or to mixed marriages. Let's look at verse 10 and 11 again. And to the married, they assume, that is an assumption, that's talking about two Christians that are married, and it only applies to two Christians that are married. And then in verse 12, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, only applies, is saying God's law does not apply to those who are non-Christians or those who are married to non-Christians. That's an assumption they make. Listen to this carefully. If the expression in verse 12, I, not the Lord, means the Lord teaching doesn't apply to mixed marriages, then not I, but the Lord must mean Paul said nothing that applied to Christians. If not, why not? You see, they take the expression of verse 12 and they're saying, since Paul says at verse 12, I, not the Lord, that the Lord's teaching doesn't apply at all. Matthew 19, Matthew 5, doesn't apply at all to a marriage where a non-Christian is involved. Doesn't apply at all to them. All right, if that's the case, then verse 10 must mean, we must apply the same thing. It must mean that Paul's teaching never applied to Christians. Is that what that means? Oh, no, that's not what that means. Well, then they've just given up their contention and their argument. Here's the point. The point is there are some specific questions that the Lord did not directly address. Now let's go back to verse 10 and 11. Should you continue in marriage? And he said that the Lord, not I, but the Lord spoke on that. Well, where did the Lord speak on that? Mark 10, Luke 16, Matthew 5, Matthew 19. The Lord said don't divorce. Now what about these other questions? A specific case of being married to a non-Christian, where did the Lord specifically address that? He didn't. Didn't say he didn't speak on it. He just didn't specifically address. What about the legitimacy of that marriage? What about the question of children born out of that marriage? Where did the Lord specifically address that in his ministry? And he did not specifically address that. He did in a general way. So when I come to verse 12, to the rest, it's not the rest of the people, but to the rest of the questions, I will address and not the Lord. Then when it's at verse 15, this is a key verse. If you don't have a note in the margin of your text, this would be a good time to do it. But the text says that if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage. In other words, they argue that you're not under the marriage bond. Not under bondage does not refer to the marriage bond of Romans 7, 3, and 4, or verse 39 of this text. It's a different word. This has to do with enslavement. I won't take the time to cite the evidence of that, but it has to do with enslavement. And we'll say more about that enslavement a little bit later. So here's two abuses. Here's the third confusion over, and that is that this text justifies staying in the marriage that you have. So some argue that when you are married and divorced and remarried, and you're in your third or fourth, fifth marriage, whatever it may be, and you obey the gospel, you can stay in that marriage. No questions asked, you just stay in that marriage. You say, well, why do they argue that? Well, look at verse 20. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he is called. Isn't that talking about marriage? You say, yeah, it is. And you're right. But let's look at the context. The context is dealing with marriage of a believer to an unbeliever, which you were told in verses 12, 13, you're to stay in that. So when you obey the gospel and you're married to a non-Christian, you stay in that marriage relationship. It is not dealing in the context with an unscriptural marriage relationship. If it is, then what about the person who is married to 10 wives? The polygamist who has 10 wives, and now he obeys the gospel. Does he keep all 10? You say, well, no, that won't work. Well, why not? If the passage is saying whatever marriage you have, when you obey the gospel, you stay in it. If that's the argument, if that's what the text is saying, that applies to the polygamist just as well. Now, that's part of the confusion. Now, I want to move finally and spend a little more time talking about the lessons that we learn, we take home with us. And we say, you know, this is a chapter that's packed full of information, and it's practical, and there's difficulty therein, but it's very practical at the same time. Let's see some lessons that we learn. Let's list several. Verses 1 to 9, I'm learning that there are times it's better not to get married. Now, the Lord said in Genesis 2 and verse 18, it's not good that man should live alone. God designed marriage for man. God thought it was good to get married. But what Paul tells us in verses 1 to 9, there are times and there are circumstances where it's better not to marry. So if some young single person comes up and says, should I get married? The answer, well, the Lord said, I would say to them, the Lord said it's not good that man should live alone. Yeah, you ought to get married. But there are some circumstance, if they were to ask me, do you think I ought to get married? The answer is going to be, you should not get married. Like what? You see, when your faithfulness and dedication may create a strain in the marriage, it may be better not to be married. In other words, if you're going to be married to someone, the person you're thinking about married, if you're being dedicated and devoted, is going to create a strain in that relationship with the Lord, that is, a strain on the relationship with the Lord, make it harder, it'd be better not to be married. That's what he was arguing here in verse 26. That's what he was saying. When you don't understand the purpose of marriage, when someone has a relationship outside of marriage and before marriage and then they get married, I'm wondering, why are you getting married? Why bother? When you don't understand the purpose and the design God has for marriage, if you don't have a clue what that is, it's better not to get married. Here's another. When you're not willing to fulfill the obligations like verses 3 to 5. I want to get married, but I don't want to feel like I'm obligated in any kind of relationship. I don't like the role that I'm given. I don't like the things, the intimate relationship responsibility that talks about in verses 3 to 5. You don't like what the text says? You're better off not to get married. When you don't understand the permanence of marriage. You say, well, I want to get married, but I don't really get this thing that it needs to be for life. If you don't understand that, you're better off not to get married. And if you're not going to try to please your mate like 32 to 35 talks about, you say, I want to get married, but I want my mate to please me. You're better off not to be married. When God's plan is not going to be followed, like the plan of leadership and submission, or maybe the plan for communication, or maybe God's plan for love and respect. See, I'm not going to follow that. You're better off not to get married. Some people are better off not to get married. The text tells me that, verses 1 to 9. Let's talk about another lesson I learned. I learned about obligations in the marriage relationship. Now, the context is dealing in verses 3 to 5 with the conjugal rights, the intimate relationship in marriage. And the Lord is saying in verses 3 to 5, that's not just a liberty, but it becomes a responsibility. Notice at verse 3, the word render is the word for pay. Seki Kubo says. Kubo usually is just a summary of BDAG. But Kubo says it means to pay. It's the same word for pay. It's an obligation. The word due is a word for debt or obligation or duty. In other words, what the text is saying, this relationship is not to be withheld from the marriage relationship. Verse 5. And we'll say more about verse 5 here in just a moment. Here's the point being made in verses 3 to 5. In the context of verses 1 to 9, he's saying it's better not to get married under this present distress. But if you do, remember there are obligations that's not to be taken lightly. You're going to enter into marriage? There's obligations that go with that. Make sure you know what those obligations are and be willing to fulfill those obligations. There are obligations you have in marriage relationship besides those of verses 3 to 5. All right, here's another lesson we learned, very practical. That we need to instill in the hearts of our children. We need to have it in our own minds and our own hearts as we look at our own marriages. Before you enter into a marriage relationship, this needs to be in our minds. We need to instill this in our children, and that is the permanence of marriage. Let's begin at verse 10. To the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. Verse 11 says, and at the end of verse 11, the husband is not to divorce his wife. Into verse 12, let him not divorce her. Verse 13, let her not divorce him. 4 times. Don't divorce, don't divorce, don't divorce, don't divorce. Now let's clarify something. The subject of verses 10 to 13 is divorce, not separation. We'll talk about separation. It's dealt with in the context, but not verses 10, 11, and 12, and 13. And quite often someone appeals, I know what this is talking about, verse 10, do not depart. It's talking about being separate. No, it's not talking about separate. It's talking about divorce. And you say, how do you know it's talking about divorce? The word depart means divorce. Thayer says it means divorce. And he cites 1 Corinthians 7:11, very verse we're looking at. And furthermore, BDAG says it means of divorce. It's the same word translated put asunder, which is the opposite of marriage, in Matthew 19 and in verse 6. And when it's applied to the husband, he turns around and said, don't depart. Verse 10 applies it to the husband. He uses the word divorce. And furthermore, one of the greatest evidences is it leaves one in an unmarried state. If you do depart, it leaves them in an unmarried state. That's divorce. That's the subject. Now, what I learned from this context, it's non-permissive. I want that to sink in for a moment. It's non-permissive. There is no permission in this context for divorce. You won't find permission in verse 10, 11, 12, or 13. Or the rest of the chapter, or anything prior to that. You won't find permission. It's non-permissive. How do I know? Well, let's look at verses 10 and then verse 11. Verse 11 says, a wife is not to depart. That sounds like it's not giving permission. It's no, don't do it. Verse 11 says, the husband is not to divorce his wife. Same thing verse 12, same thing verse 13. Now, why do I say it's not permissive? Someone said, well, look at verse 11. But if she does depart, he's granting permission. Well, I want you to notice right here that there is a prohibition in 1 Corinthians 7. Let her not depart. Do not do that. There is no permission in saying, but if she does. No permission given in that. It's just simply contingency law that if she does, she has to now remain unmarried or be reconciled. She can't remarry anybody else. It didn't say she did right or God approved or God gave permission for that. Let me give you a parallel. Look at 1 John chapter 2 and in verse 1. He said, I write unto you that you might not sin. That's non-permissive. He is not saying you should sin. He's saying you don't sin. But notice the phrase he uses, very parallel. But if any man sin, is that granting permission? Oh, it's saying it's all right to sin. It's saying you really shouldn't. But if you do, it's okay. No. If you do sin, we have an advocate with the Father. It's not permissive. Non-permissive all throughout. The point is, do not divorce. Look at verse 10, a wife is not to depart. Verse 11, a husband is not to divorce. Verse 12, let him not divorce her. Verse 13, let her not divorce him. How much plainer can that be? There is no permission. In fact, there is prohibition all throughout. Here's another lesson I learned from this context. And that is that faith and spiritual matters are more important than marriage. Now that's a hard lesson for some people to get. That faith and spiritual matters are more important than marriage. You say, nothing is more important than my marriage relationship. Well, if that's the case, nothing is more important, the Lord is not more important than your marriage relationship, then not only is your spiritual relationship doomed for failure, your marriage is probably doomed for failure as well. And so what I'm learning from verse 15 is that faith and spiritual matters is more important than marriage. Now notice at verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. You're a Christian married to a non-Christian, and the unbeliever decides to depart. They're going to divorce you. They leave you. Let them depart. Didn't say you should depart. Didn't say you should divorce them. It said if they depart, let them depart. So we raise a question. Why is the unbeliever departing? The nature of the question seems to point to where one mate has become a Christian and now the unbelieving mate suffers along with the Christian in this present distress. Now you put yourself in the place of being a non-Christian. You both have been living ungodly. You both have been living up life with all the gusto, and then suddenly your mate decides they want to get religious. Now view it from the standpoint of the non-Christian. They decide they want to get religious. They've joined this thing called Christianity. And they started saying, we're not going to, and they are being persecuted and you're suffering with them. And you may give an ultimatum to your mate. You know, it's either you follow that Christianity stuff, or you follow Christ, or you follow me, and it's not going to be both ways. That seems to be the thing saying in the context. Where the Christian is given an alternative, it's either marriage or it's Christ. You either keep the marriage or you choose Christ. You can't have them both. What if your mate tells you that? Go back to verse 15. With that in mind, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Now, we've already pointed out that's not the marriage bond. You say, how do you know? It's a different word. This is a word, it's not the same word that's found in Romans 7, and 1 Corinthians 7:39. This is the word for enslavement. What I want you to see is that this is enslavement, and furthermore, the tense, it's perfect tense in Greek, which means not that you're not now enslaved. It means you never have been enslaved. In case you missed it, I want you to get that point. It's perfect tense in Greek, which means not only are you not enslaved, you never have been in bondage. You never have been in this. This is a bondage you've never been in. What's the point? The point is you are never enslaved to a marriage to save it at the expense of your faith. So if there's some compromise you have to make with your faith to salvage your marriage, you are not obligated to salvage your marriage at the expense of your faith. You never have been enslaved to the marriage. You're not in bondage. None of us are. I'm not in that bondage and you're not in that bondage. Not only are we not now, we never have been. Never will be. You're never obligated to save your marriage at the expense of your faith. Well, you know what that tells me? That tells me that faith and spiritual matters are more important than marriage. That's a powerful lesson, isn't it? But then here's something else I learned from this context. Let's go back to verse 5, the conditions of separation. And that is, a common idea is we can separate for any reason, we just can't divorce. You see, we get the principle of verse 10 and 11 in Matthew 19, 1-6. We get that down in our mind. I know we can't get divorced. I know we can't divorce, but we're having marriage trouble. I tell you what we'll do. We'll separate. How long are you going to separate? Well, who knows? It may be for a year, maybe 2 years. It may be forever. We're going to separate. But I know we can't divorce. I know we can't do that. That's wrong. We don't want to do that. But we'll just separate indefinitely. And we live separate. Because we can do that. And they fail to ignore some things in the context. Listen to me carefully. Verse 5 is the only verse, the only text addressing separation to my knowledge. You may have another one, and so I'm interested in seeing it. But I don't know of another text that specifically addresses separation than 1 Corinthians 7 and 5. You say, what about verse 10? We've already talked about verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, verse 13. Deals with divorce. This is the only passage Verse 5, what does it say? Do not deprive one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, that you come together again, so that Satan do not tempt you for your lack of self-control. Now, let's see what this text is saying. It specifies one cause. And that's very parallel to divorce for one cause. You remember, we drive home the principle quite often. You can only get a divorce for the cause of fornication. There's one cause, and any other cause is unscriptural. The same thing must be true of separation. What are the conditions of separation? I have people sometimes call me, members of other congregations across the country where I've been in meetings, and we're having marital problems, and what would you advise? We're thinking of separating. All right, if it meets these conditions. Let's go to verse 5. That it's with consent. You both agree. You don't just leave them, but you got to agree. There's consent. For a time, there's an agreed time. We're going to separate, and we're going to separate for a time, an agreed time. And it's for the purpose that you're giving yourselves to fasting and prayer. You're not separating because you got to cool off and cool your tempers. You're separating to give yourself to fasting and prayer. And then, there's something else at verse 5. You're going to come back together again, lest Satan tempt you for your lack of self-control. If it meets that condition, then it's scriptural. If it doesn't, it's unscriptural. That's all I know to say about that, because that's the only text that addresses that. I don't know of another one that addresses that. Now here's the final lesson we're going to learn, and the lesson will be yours. And that's the value of marrying a Christian. One of the things I learned from this context, that it's far better to marry a Christian. But I learned from this same context that it's not unscriptural. So Paul's admonition in this context, if you're married to a non-Christian, stay in that marriage. So that tells me it's not unscriptural. And there's some who may want me to say, it's sinful to marry a non-Christian, but I can't say that because the Lord doesn't tell me to say that. I can't say that. I got to stick with what the text says. So the Lord said, stay in it. So that tells me it's not unscriptural to be married to non-Christians. It's just not wise. But there are some Christians who say, well, if it's just unwise, then I'll just jump right into that marriage relationship because there's no sin. Well, no one's saying it's sin. It's just a matter of how wise and unwise and how difficult it will be. Now, what do we see in the context? The context is saying that you're going through this present distress. It's going to be far more difficult for you if you're married to a non-Christian because you don't have the same faith. You don't have someone supporting you. And you may have a tendency to want to draw back in your faith because you're trying to spare your family, verses 33 to 35. Consider from that context, then this is the closest relationship on earth. It's one flesh. That is, you are described in the marriage relationship as being one flesh. Do you want to be joined as one flesh? That's not just the intimate relationship. That's blending your lives together, one in your mind, in your goals, and your aims, and your purpose, with someone that doesn't have the same faith that you have. They don't have the like precious faith. The marriage, the one flesh, blends the personalities. That was the argument made in 1 Corinthians 6, why you don't go commit fornication with this harlot, because that's part of blending your personality with them. You're blending your personality with someone that is not a child of God. Without taking time to develop Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 7, the unbeliever has an influence upon the believer. You say, well, I have influence on them. That's true. That's true. But it's also true that the unbeliever has influence on the believer. You have influence on each other. They may influence you to be weaker. That person that you're marrying that's a non-Christian is going to be a parent to your child when you have children. Do you want your children to be reared by non-Christians who may not have the same principles that you have? And if you marry a Christian, you have a common ground to guide you in your marriage relationship. You have a common standard, the Word of God. You have a common Savior and Lord and ruler that directs you in all that you believe and all that you practice in the marriage relationship. But if you're marrying a non-Christian, that may not be the same. And so I'm learning something about the value of marrying a Christian. What have we seen? 1 Corinthians 7. I was asked if I could look at that passage sometime and perhaps clarify some things. There is confusion. So we see an overview of the chapter. We see the setting, the present distress, some of the confusion that reigns, and some practical lessons that we learn from this difficult at times chapter, but also a very powerful, practical chapter. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge the faith that you have, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and sing?